Imagine you wake up tomorrow in a country where you can't open YouTube, you can't Google anything, you can't criticize the leader even in a whisper. And if you try to organize a protest, there is no crowd to join you because the crowd is watching you. Here's the part that should bother you. North Korea has about 26 million people. That is roughly the population of an entire mid-sized country. And yet, it runs like a seed machine. Not a democracy, not a dictatorship in the usual sense either. It runs like a closed operating system. So the real question is not, why is North Korea poor? The real question is, why is North Korea the way it is today? How does the control of 26 million people happen without the revolt? How does it function in a globalized world? And if America talks non-stop about democracy, why didn't the US change the regime yet? This case study is basically one lesson. North Korea survives because it is a system, not just a dictator. And once you understand that system, you begin to see why it has survived more than 70 years through famine, sanction, economic collapse, and global pressure.
To understand North Korea, you have to start with the Korean War, because almost everything the country does today runs straight back to what happened between 1950 and 1953. That war did not simply damage the peninsula, it erased large parts of it. American bombing destroyed most of Pyongyang along with nearly every other city in the north, and the industry that went with them. Across both Koreas, the death toll ran into the millions, and the majority of the dead were civilians. Then, on July 27, 1953, the shooting stopped. It wasn't because of a surrender. It wasn't even because of a peace treaty. It stopped with an armistice, which is really just a formal agreement to stop firing. Kim Il-sung and the men around him came out of that war holding one question: what stops this from happening again? The answer they landed on was absolute control. The logic was simple. Weakness invites invasion, and anything unpredictable inside the country counts as a weakness. Therefore, nothing unpredictable could be allowed to grow. No opposition party, no independent newspaper, no church, no union, no business, and no family strong enough to become a second center of gravity. Over the next 70 years, that answer hardened into a state unlike any other on earth. It became a hereditary dynasty that still calls itself revolutionary, passing power from Kim Il-sung to his son Kim Jong-il, and then to his grandson Kim Jong-un. This is where most global analysts get it wrong. People talk about North Korea as if it is just one man. It is not. The Kim family sits at the top of a machine, and the machine is far bigger than the family. It is the Workers' Party of Korea, the armed forces, the internal security services. It is the bureaucracy that decides who gets a job, a home, a ration card, and a permit to travel to the next province. Even if you take away any single Kim, that machine is going to keep turning. It was designed to. To survive, that machine stands on three distinct legs. In the 1950s, Kim Il-sung started promoting the idea of juche, which became the official doctrine of the state. Juche is usually translated as self-reliance, and outsiders often mistake it for an economic philosophy. It is not. It is a political one. The point was never to make North Koreans wealthy. The point was to make the system unshakable, fusing loyalty to the leader with the survival of the nation. The second leg is the military. Under Kim Jong-il, the state adopted the slogan Songan, meaning military first. In a country that has spent 70 years expecting an invasion that never came, the army eats before anyone else does, and everyone in the country understands why. The third leg is social control. It is the part of the system nobody outside the country talks about, even though it shapes daily life more than any slogan. In the years after the war, the state began sorting every family by their political loyalty. That system is called Songbun. Because of Songbun, your grandfather's record still decides what you are allowed to study, where you are allowed to live, and how far you can rise in society. Loyalty stopped being an opinion in North Korea a long time ago. It became inherited property.
Most people assume revolts happen because people get angry enough. That assumption is wrong, and North Korea is the clearest proof of it. In the mid-1990s, the country went through a famine so severe that its own propaganda gave it a name: the Arduous March.
The Soviet Union had collapsed, so subsidized fuel and fertilizer stopped arriving. Floods wrecked what harvests were left, and the public food distribution system simply stopped working for most of the population. Estimates of how many people starved to death range from a few 100,000 to well over 1 million. If that level of suffering hit almost any other country, the government would have been overthrown in days. But in North Korea, it did not end the regime. If anger alone produced revolutions, North Korea would have had one 30 years ago. A successful revolt actually requires 3 things to happen at the exact same time. People have to be angry, they have to be able to coordinate with each other, and they have to believe they can win. North Korea tolerates the first one, but it has spent 70 years actively destroying the second and third. It achieves this through 4 incredibly effective locks. The first lock is information. Comparison is where dissatisfaction starts. If you can see how people live somewhere else, you realize what you are missing. To prevent this, televisions and radios are physically built or altered to receive only state channels. There is no open internet for ordinary citizens, just a walled domestic network. Millions of people own mobile phones, but those phones cannot call outside the country. When you cannot measure your life against anything on the outside, hardship does not automatically feel like an injustice. It just feels like weather. And the thing that grows in that soil is not rebellion, it is resignation. The second lock is organization. To overthrow a government, you need networks, trusted leaders, a way to communicate, and a place to meet where nobody is watching. North Korea attacks all of this at the street level. Households are grouped into neighborhood units called inminban, usually made up of a few dozen families. The unit leader is expected to know who lives there, who is visiting, and who came home late. Add in compulsory workplace and study sessions, plus permits required just to travel to the next town, and the physical act of organizing in secret becomes almost impossible. Anger stays private. And private anger is harmless to a regime. The third lock is the elite. Every regime on earth ultimately survives at the pleasure of its generals, party officials, and security chiefs. If they defect, the government collapses, usually within days. So, the system runs a loyalty economy. The best housing, food, medicine, and education are concentrated in Pyongyang and distributed downward as a reward. Everyone in that inner circle is watched, including the watchers. And every so often, the message is delivered in a way nobody can misread. In December 2013, Kim Jong-un had his own uncle, Jang Song-taek, one of the most powerful men in the country, stripped of everything and executed. It was a brutal reminder that to maintain absolute order, no one is untouchable. The fourth lock is fear. North Korea runs a network of political prison camps, and punishment can extend to entire families across generations. This means the risk of speaking out is never yours alone to take. You are risking the lives of your children and your parents. In 2014, a United Nations Commission examined this system in detail and concluded it amounted to crimes against humanity. Pyongyang rejected the report, and the camps are still operating. North Korea has not eliminated anger. It has eliminated coordination, and anger without coordination almost never becomes a revolution. However, the total control story is a little too neat. Since the famine, informal black markets called jangmadang have become essential to how ordinary people actually eat, and the state has been forced to tolerate them. Smuggled memory cards and USB drives carrying South Korean dramas have been quietly circulating for 2 decades. Along the Chinese border, people use smuggled phones to reach the outside world. The walls have cracks in them, and the leadership knows it. That is exactly why the last few years have brought harsher penalties for consuming foreign media, and even tighter control of the borders.
Now the paradox. How does a country this closed survive inside a global economy this connected? The answer is that North Korea is not disconnected at all. It is selectively connected, through channels it controls, and there are 3 of them that matter. The first is China, and this one is not closed. China accounts for the overwhelming majority of North Korea's recorded foreign trade year after year. Most of it crosses at a single pressure point, the bridge between Dandong on the Chinese side and Sinŭiju on the Korean side. Food, fuel,
fertilizer, machinery, and consumer goods go in. Minerals, labor, and manufactured goods come out. Beijing's motive here gets misread constantly. This is not friendship, and it certainly is not shared ideology anymore. It is stability. A North Korean collapse would put a refugee crisis, a scramble for loose nuclear weapons, and possibly an American-aligned army on China's own border. Compared to that, keeping a difficult neighbor alive is cheap. In 2017 alone, the United Nations Security Council banned North Korean exports of coal, iron ore, seafood, and textiles, capped how much refined petroleum the country could import, and ordered member states to send North Korean workers home. On paper, that should have closed the economy. In practice, restrictions like these do not stop trade so much as push it somewhere harder to sea. Tankers meet at sea and transfer cargo ship to ship with their tracking transponders switched off. Vessels change names and flags. The third channel is the one that genuinely changed the game, and it did not exist when this system was designed. Cyber operations. North Korean hacking units, tracked under names like Lazarus Group, have turned theft into a revenue stream that needs no ports, no ships, and no banks willing to take the risk. In February 2025, roughly $1.5 billion in cryptocurrency was drained from the exchange Bybit, and the FBI publicly attributed that theft to North Korea. It was the largest single crypto theft ever recorded. Chainalysis, a firm that traces blockchain transactions, estimated that North Korean actors stole around $2 billion over the course of 2025, and something close to $6.75 billion in total since 2022. Alongside that, thousands of North Korean IT workers have been hired by Western companies under fake identities, quietly sending their salaries home. For a state cut out of the international financial system, this is close to perfect. There is now a fourth channel, and it is the most consequential development in North Korean foreign policy in a generation. In June 2024, Kim Jong-un and Vladimir Putin signed a comprehensive strategic partnership treaty in Pyongyang, including a mutual defense clause. North Korea then sent artillery shells, missiles, and, somewhere in the region of 11,000 to 12,000 soldiers to fight in Russia's Kursk region. In return, North Korea gets food, fuel, hard currency, diplomatic cover, and, analysts widely assume, access to military technology it could not develop on its own. Which brings us to the real point about isolation. North Korea is not outside globalization. It is inside it, using the parts of it that are hardest to police.
North Korea builds missiles. It has tested nuclear weapons 6 times. It has fired ballistic missiles over Japan. And yet, decade after decade, through sanctions and condemnations and collapsed negotiations, the country is still there. So the more interesting question is not why North Korea behaves the way it does. Pyongyang's behavior is actually quite rational once you accept its goals. The question is why the rest of the world puts up with it. And the answer is that North Korea has become load-bearing. In geopolitics, there is a category of country that exists mainly because it sits between larger powers, absorbing friction that would otherwise be direct. A buffer state. Look at Northeast Asia, and North Korea is exactly that, wedged between China, Russia, and an American alliance system running through South Korea and Japan. Now imagine it vanished overnight. The most likely outcome is a unified Korea aligned with Washington, which would place American military influence directly against China's border. For Beijing, that is unacceptable. And it explains a policy that otherwise looks contradictory. China does not want North Korea to grow strong. It also cannot allow North Korea to collapse. Underneath all of it sits the nuclear question. And this is the pillar that holds the rest up. North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2003, tested its first device in 2006, and by 2017 was testing intercontinental ballistic missiles. Before a state has nuclear weapons, removing its government is a difficult military problem. Afterward, it becomes a risk almost nobody will accept. Pyongyang understands this better than most capitals do. It cannot win a conventional war against the United States, and it has never needed to. It only needs the price of a confrontation to look unacceptable.
We tend to assume that countries endure because they are strong. Sometimes they endure because everyone around them has quietly calculated that change would be more dangerous than the present arrangement. North Korea has spent 70 years turning that calculation into a survival strategy. And so far, it is working.